have, so in that case, Michael and all in favor? Yes. Who's opposed? Martin is opposed. Okay, that's carried. Item number 2, adoption of the minutes from previous meeting.
That's one typo, you said?
Yes,
Yes.
we should confirm that.
It's Kirsty after all these years, not Christy.
Oh, yeah, it's Kirsty.
Yeah.
Oh, was that the typo?
You're the
That's the
typo!
I don't know, I spell it wrong all the time, so I never even notice. Oh, it is, yeah.
Sorry. I'll forgive you.
We're asking
No,
anyone
it's
with
my
a name
name's
that
there.
begins with K to change their name tonight. So
Oh.
that would be you.
And you're supposed to be named David, aren't you?
Yeah.
Exactly. So with that one typo amended, do I have a motion to adopt the minutes from the previous meeting? Dennis, second. Martin, all in favor? It's carried. So, the public is spurning us again. So we'll move on to item 4, which is the business arising from the minutes. We're going to do the development procedure bylaw first. And Conservation Development Subcommittee second. Is everyone okay with that order of events?
Sure.
All right. So Daniel, turn things over to you.
Thank you. So we talked about this at the May meeting. I don't have a presentation today, or I thought it was, there's not very many visuals to go over anyways. I should
Right.
but so what I've done over the summer is I drafted a development procedure bylaw for us to replace our existing one. And then the report tries to highlight, okay, what's new in it from what we currently do. What's a new requirement, what's an expanded requirement. So it goes through, and I can go through essentially the report in detail if people are interested, and if people start to glaze over, I'll speed up. But so one of the things that we do by practice now, but not by bylaws, we do development variance permit notice requirements. So we're not required to post them in the paper and advertise signs on the property, but we do. And so we felt like because we do it all the time, we should put it in our development bylaw, and we should continue to do it. And then as well capturing agency referrals, so just it sort of reflects what we do, that we refer it out to other agencies and we expect comment back, and sort of formalizing how that works. And then in terms of new requirements, I put one in here. A big one for us just internally in our department is a lapse of application, like when does an application expire? So we have ones that are sort of sitting there and the applicant no longer responds, but you know, if we give it 2 or 3 years, they're going to come back and say, oh, about my application that I had. And we have some rezonings in our system that are, you know, submitted in 2010, and they're sort of still there. And we say they're on hold, and we say, okay, they come back, we're going to charge them again. We don't actually get to the bylaw, and they would probably come back and say, no, I still have an application that's still current. And so some way of saying that it's expired and it's no longer.
So you're proposing 6 months and then a potential extension of 6 months?
Yeah.
So is that a reasonable, I don't know
Yeah.
whether that was a reasonable amount or not. It
Yeah.
seemed quite short to me, considering how long things take, but.
Yeah, so we say so for when it's inactive for 6 months. So if, you know, we have applications that by all means take longer than that, but normally there's back and forth. So they've submitted something, we say we're referring it, and we'll go back for comment, or they're working through council and we having council stuff. But in terms of any active application we have, I wouldn't say we have any that would sit for 6 months at a time, or definitely not for a year.
Okay,
Yeah.
I don't,
Yeah.
I only have you just say
Do
that.
you
Yeah.
have a mechanism for verifying whether it's inactive?
Yeah, that was my concern, but
Yeah.
how do you judge
Yeah.
that it's
Yeah.
inactive? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, if it's just sitting on your desk and you haven't done anything for 6
Yeah.
months,
Yeah,
that's inactive, but it's not fair to.
for them, yeah.
And
Like
I
if
just-
they're just waiting for financing, or, you know, like discussions on that, that could take a long time.
Hi, David.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, would it be active if, for example, to use Kirsty's situation, they wrote and said, you haven't heard from us for a while because we're waiting for financing?
Yeah.
Would that make it active from that point on? Or do they need to take some sort of more substantive step?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I think it might be worth-
they would probably have to take more like, that would work for them to say, okay, we've extended it for a period, or we still indicated, but if they said, well, we're waiting for financing, we might say,
That's not relevant to planning. I
Yeah, you're
suppose.
not-
Maybe
not
that's not a
actively
good example.
pursuing it.
Maybe they're waiting for a geologist report.
yeah. I would think so, if they're conducting a study or something, especially if we've asked for a study. Like if we say, we get comments back and say, you need to go study something, and they say, well, we've hired a person, and they're doing it, and they expect to be done, I'd say they're still active. But if they say, well, we're thinking about going to, like, I can think of one that we have where it went to council and we told them, okay, you have to go do studies.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if they will do studies, or if they, sort of don't really want to pay for it, but if nothing happens for a period, at some point, we're gonna say, okay, you haven't done them, you're not doing it. And I think with this, like, we're going through this with our old building permit applications now, where essentially we have a process where we actually write them and we say, you're inactive, you haven't done anything, if you don't respond to us. So some step in there, and we can write that into the bylaw. Some step where we notify people that we will be closing.
I don't know if this example would be useful for you,
Yeah.
but the courts are very worried about lawsuits that get started and don't go anywhere. They have the same problem you do.
Yeah.
So they talk about the litigant must take a step.
Okay.
So it has to be a real, not just a phone call, it has to
Yeah.
be a real step in the process.
Yeah.
A step to advance the process. I'm wondering if we shouldn't try and define inactive.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, if it's defined in here, then it's
Yeah.
known up front.
Sure.
Then,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. That's good feedback.
Yeah, I was thinking that it was sort of analogous to a building permit, which has some, you've got to start construction, but that's very obvious.
Yeah.
When something's,
Yeah.
right? Whereas with a planning issue, it's different.
Yeah.
There could be lots of things going on in the background that you wouldn't be aware
Yeah.
of.
Is there a procedure to apply for an extension?
So what's in the bylaw right now is it can be extended for a 6 months upon their written request, or it would just be an email really to say extended, but, yeah.
But, so that would give them a year,
Yeah.
and then, so you, at that point, you'll just definitely cut them off as opposed to maybe 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, typically, our normal practice here is we tend to be nicer and give,
Yeah.
so it's like, if it was for 6 months and 6 months, or for a year, that means probably after 2 years of doing nothing, we're definitely, be thinking about cutting them off.
I notice you give yourself discretion, because it says
Yeah.
you may extend the
Yeah.
deadline, it doesn't say you have to.
Yeah,
Because you presumably you'd want to, if they made that request, your question would be, what would I do? Why do you
Yeah.
have the time?
yeah,
Of course, if you make a request, that's a step.
It's something,
Yeah.
we're doing something, yeah.
Right.
I don't think,
I mean, one could see this as a tool for dealing with undesirable applications,
Right.
perhaps, especially if they seem abandoned.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, more because I know, like, we have one rezoning now where they applied several years ago, and every 6 months they kind of show up and they say, oh, here's something else that, that you've been waiting for, and then they kind of go away, and then they come back again in 6 months. Say, oh, here's another piece that I needed for my application. So they would still be active by this, but at some point it's like, okay, you gotta, if you want us to proceed, you have to take it seriously too, as an application.
How do other municipalities do it?
I mean, I stole this directly from Seashell.
Okay.
In there, like I know, and this is more buildings, I did our building bylaw this summer too. There's a model bylaw that had a time, and I think I doubled it. Like it said 180 days, and I made it a year instead. And
And what's the policy? The policy involved for building permits is you must begin work within a year, correct?
it's if you're inactive for a year.
Then you must reapply or reactivate
Yeah.
your permit.
Yeah. And so like with building permits, last summer, we wrote to all the people who were inactive and said, you've been inactive for more than a year, like, contact us. And then this summer, we went through and canceled ones that hadn't been followed up. So we essentially doubled the period in our bylaw. We said,
Wow.
okay, yeah.
Isn't that in the act, though? Regarding building permits?
I can still right now at some point.
The local government act, you mean?
The building code act, which one?
So the building code act, yeah.
That expires, I think, 1 year, and it comes from the national, I think. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I'm
but I
not sure
thought
either,
it's-
although that timeframe I run into in several different
Oh, yeah, yeah,
jurisdictions.
it's
Yeah.
uniform throughout the country.
Right. So, so you borrowed this from Seashell?
Yeah. Knowing that, I think one of my goals going in was that we had some way to notify people and tell them you've lapsed, you're no longer,
Right.
we don't have to keep this one current as an
So
application.
I imagine from staff's perspective, if you've got to reactivate in some way, or
Yeah.
every 6 months or a year, an applicant comes back and gives you a new piece of information, you've got to activate the file again.
Yeah,
That's probably pretty inefficient.
yeah. Yeah, our preference, is the applicant comes with everything, and they like respond to stuff, and we can move it through and get the
Yeah,
solution
right.
on the file or not.
Is there a wish, Michael, you initiated this discussion, do you think it should be changed?
Well, I just think it would be useful if there were some definition of inactive.
Right.
Yeah,
So that, and I was starting off just, one way of doing it is just give you discretion. The manager may deem an application inactive if the applicant has not taken a step in the previous 6 months.
yeah,
A meaningful step?
Yeah, meaningful, substantive, I would suggest, but just step, and then it would be up to the manager to decide whether or not anything that was done,
yeah.
other than just kind of collaring you on the ferry and saying, I'm still working on it.
Right. Or a phone call saying the same,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so then you could, that gives a little bit of clarity. If you're going to lapse somebody, then that, they need to argue, we did take a step.
Yeah.
We did order the geologist report, it's just that he's so busy,
Yeah,
and then you've got the discretion to grant the extension.
yeah,
That works for you? I don't know, I just
Yeah.
spur of the moment thinking
yeah.
anymore. It just worried me a little bit that we have the same provision no matter what the reason for the inactivity is, and there might be valid reasons and there might be less valid reasons, so this will give you that bit of leeway.
Yeah.
Do you feel there should be wording that says something regarding the discretion of the manager?
Well, I would just add that the manager may deem an application inactive if the applicant has not taken to use David's word, significant step in the previous 6 months.
Right.
That work for you?
I mean, that works, the actual wording now is upon determination of the manager that an application has been enacted, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, so that would be
Turn that in.
replaced, that would replace that 619.
Yeah, I think your word
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a couple other minor comments if we're at that stage.
Yeah.
And I noticed this because I used to do it all the time when I was drafting.
Yeah.
Paragraph 6.8 says despite 6.8, it should be 6.7, so whenever you make a revision, you gotta.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The other one is just, I think it's just, no, this is really anal, a missing period on page 6. The last, the 7.2, form satisfactory to the chief financial officer, period.
Yeah.
Because I read it as chief financial officer security. I thought, who's that chief financial officer security?
Okay, so that's page 14.
That's where I was thinking.
Page 14,
Yeah.
Oh, and there's a formatting error in 8.3. So the,
Yeah.
oh, and David, why don't I let you carry this one,
All right,
because you and I talked about it in the car.
I'm sorry, that's on page 17 and 33.
Yeah.
8.13, the applicant shall at his sole expense. Perhaps it should be the applicant shall at the applicant's sole
Yeah.
expense. I mean, it could be a she, it could be an it.
or at there, so.
There.
There, isn't that
Are
the-
there so
isn't
expensive?
that the-
So Steph and I were at this
Yeah.
bylaw drafting workshop last week.
Yeah.
And they said in the Interpretation Act, any his or her refers to both, but they said So in standard bylaw, if you said his or her, you don't, because I think this one even at the start says like if you.
No, I know, there's,
Right, you do
there's the gender non-specific,
Yeah.
specificity,
But then they
put her
said,
in there.
yeah, but then they
Learn
said,
some cool points.
but they said go through instead of you better redrafting it to say, you know, the applicant. I forget how they said it.
Okay,
But essentially, so you don't have to say his, but, or her, but you
Was
say
she
like.
the one who said person, and then Dawn came up and said he prefers there? It was that.
Yeah, yeah. So it was after that workshop, I was like, oh, I should go through and redraft this whole bylaw.
Did they talk to you about and/or at your workshop as well?
They
No,
had in mind,
yeah.
Yeah. And what did they tell you about
they
it?
don't like it.
No,
It's
I
either
don't like
and or it's boring.
8.24?
Oh,
I
we
think.
like it though.
Just run the search function for
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's,
applicants request an OCP amendment or a land use bylaw,
Yes.
Yeah.
or both, must provide a summary. That's the usual way of doing it.
Yeah.
This is, I don't know if you want this, my spell checker, if you put wordsmith, it comes out as wordsmite. No idea why.
Sounds like you're
So I hope you
saying.
find this wordsmite.
need to add it to your dictionary.
But then just sort of to go back to the overview, just briefly. So the other pieces that we were adding was posting of signs. So currently we post signs through a variance permit, and so this would say that okay, the applicant does it at his or her or their expense, but also extend it to rezonings, which currently we don't post signs, which doesn't have a whole lot of reason behind it, other than we started doing it for variance permits and just haven't done it for rezonings. And then the second one, our next one was public information meetings, so it's sort of specifying and outlining what they are and at the applicant's expense as well. And currently half the time either we will host it and do it, or we end up with this very silly fight with an applicant about who's actually hosting it and paying for it. It's just a waste of everybody's time. And then the next one is that talking about security deposits, which is something we can do for development permits and development variance permits, and just outlines, okay, what is a deposit and what do we accept and all those pieces. And then the last one, which is a little controversial here, is about independent review and saying we can actually do an independent review of an applicant's studies that they do when they submit, which hasn't come up here to a huge extent, but we would like to have as an option that if somebody submits something, we can say, have somebody else look at it as well for a second
Who,
view.
who would the author of the original study have been?
Like an applicant's professional.
Right. Oh, an applicant professionals. So,
Yeah.
but you're looking for a peer review of the study
Yeah.
provided by
Yeah.
the applicant,
Yeah,
although the applicant didn't actually do the study.
Yeah.
work. Okay.
yeah.
Would it not be inherently independent because of that, the authorship, or no?
I guess, so we get the most for development permits, and it has come up that, like the applicant submits the environmental study with their development permit. And we've, twice I think that we've gotten complaints from other environmental professionals that say, well, they called me about it and I gave them some advice and I was going to do a report, and then they hired somebody else. So it's like, we don't know necessarily, did the applicant hire 3 environmental professionals, and you get the one report that turned out. Yeah. So it always gets a little iffy in terms of peer review of professional reports.
Right.
But as we're drafting it and looking at other reports, I go, are there bylaws? I go, okay, I wouldn't mind having that as an option.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are my high points, and then, like I said, after going to this course with staff, I was going to sit down and redraft everything as a piece. But wanted to hear general feedback on the bylaw and thoughts from the ABC first.
Looks good.
Sorry,
Yeah.
the independent review,
Yeah.
so sort of, it seems to tread a little bit on the toes of the professional associations.
Yeah.
Have you reached out to ABC and AABC?
I have previously about a different thing reached out about peer reviews, and it was like, they said, well, some people won't do them. And that was part of my recruiting officer course as well, and that, like, best practice then is the professionals doing it, they reach out to professionals to the original.
Because you're almost questioning their
Yeah.
professional
Yeah.
ethics.
Yeah, so I was saying,
Mm-hmm.
It's a little, it's funny.
at this stage of this kind of application, it would primarily be something like an environmental report, or, but it could be something.
And it could be
a
something
geotechnical report.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I tend to agree with Martin. It feels a
Yeah.
little bit like, if you receive a geotechnical report from a professional engineer, it's
See,
intended, with a seal, it's
Yeah.
intended to be unbiased.
Yeah.
And if the municipality is turning around and saying, well, we think it might be biased, so we're gonna bring in another engineer to review that, feels a little bit clunky to me.
Yeah. And yeah, I see it more, I guess, in the environmental ones. And I know like what we try to do with, like for rezonings when there's studies involved, is actually be involved in the terms of reference side of the study before the study's done, and have input that way to ensure that like the directions that are being given are comprehensive and cover what we want to cover.
Right.
Or we work then after the fact with the professional saying, okay, you didn't answer these questions, like I still have these questions outstanding, and you know, like why aren't they addressed in the report, and how can you address them to sort of answer the questions that we have still.
Right. I wonder if the other way you could deal with that is there a sense that there are people offering environmental consulting services, you know, near us, that might provide a report which would be less than factual?
No, like I can't think of like a specific thing. I think it's more just a big picture thing that I'd like to have that as an option. Yeah.
Okay.
Seems to me it would be good to have an internal policy around
Yeah.
this. It's probably not published in this bylaw, but policy that
Yeah.
really deals with the process where you would approach the association.
And I did, like when I had included that part, I did reach out to our municipal solicitor and ask him about this, because we've had it before, and it comes up almost more often in subdivisions for whatever reason, and so I've had it in a variety of my subdivision courses and working with Judy, our approving officer. And yeah, and he said the same thing. He's like, well, you can require it, and you can do it, and you can charge it to the applicant, but you'd want to have internal policies that say, okay, this is what has triggered the need for an independent study, as opposed to just, working with the professional who submitted the study in the first place.
And so that's not in place at the moment, though,
No, that's not in place.
that policy?
No.
Right. But I agree with what Martin's thinking on this. I think it would be useful to have that policy in place.
Yeah.
It seems it would cover the municipality in the event that there's some question about why this has happened, and why do I have to pay for another consultant to review
Yeah.
the report that I've already paid for.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, like we do currently in subdivisions where we have been using a civil engineer consultant to review submissions from the civil engineer of the applicant.
Right.
Which is commonly, like larger municipalities would have, an engineer
So-
on staff who would be reviewing the work of the professional engineer who submitted it, and so we contracted out to a separate civil engineer.
Does that work for you, Martin? Is that, if a policy were in place?
Yeah, in general, I think that would be wise to have some sort of, again, mechanism to understand how to approach it. And what the steps are.
Yeah. And what would you say, like, I don't sort of talk to, more engineering side, but like the architect profession.
Architects don't make mistakes.
Yeah, right. Architects don't admit to me.
That's right, yeah. It can be quite, I think, well, I mean, ultimately, it's, it's more to do with code compliance later on
Yeah.
in the permit process. That's where things may fall apart a little bit sometimes in applications, but that wouldn't be coming through.
Not for a variance application or
Yeah.
subdivision.
So, but I mean, ultimately it'd be the same approach. You would
Yeah.
just go to the AIBC and get their advice.
I guess that would be, yeah, like I'm trying to think, so in the variance, if somebody, like if an applicant submitted a code compliance report as part of a rezoning or something to say that building would last, and then we said, okay, we want an independent review of the code compliance report. Like, is that something an architect would do, or would you instead?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, does that happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having said that, of course, there are firms whose, their single practice is the building code,
Yeah,
right? They're building code consultants, fire protection engineers, that's what they do.
yeah,
And again, typically the principals in a firm like that would be registered professionals, they'd be engineers or architects. So their acts are, they have to operate within the context of their
Yeah.
act.
yeah,
So,
Yeah, I mean, owners are not permitted through the act, the Architects Act or the Engineers Act, to hire more than one professional to carry out the same, or the same service.
yeah,
So, but as a peer review, I mean, that's not, there's no conflict of interest, so. I don't know, to me, it just seems to be easiest if your policy dictated that if there's any ambiguity or any question around an application, then just go to the association for their advice. How to do it. And you're ultimately looking to do an independent review, but
yeah,
having their input would protect the municipality from
yeah,
a messy situation.
yeah. Well, that's anything, yeah, with this, it's like, we would be using this in a messy situation, would be at the start, and yeah, how to avoid it getting worse. Cool.
And I'm sure the associations will be very happy to help.
yeah.
So, it's their job.
Well,
That's all yeah, I mean, there's the bylaw, so I'm happy for people to go through it. Like I said, I'm gonna be redoing it, so if people are, sleepless nights and want to read it and send me comments, that would be appreciated
Did
too.
you want a recommendation or just not really?
I mean, I don't have a bylaw number for it yet, and so I guess more looking for ABC's comment in that, would you rather I redraft and come back again, or would you rather I go to council for reading and then come back to the ABC? What would be your preference in terms of recommendation for reviewing it?
I would say we should read it in between and forward any comments to you
Okay.
individually. I mean, like I said, it seemed like a good, solid bylaw, and there may be little tweaks, and
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing we'd be looking for.
So then maybe then I'll take comments and I'll redraft, you can send anything, and then I'll send it to council for first reading, and then to come back to ABC in between, you can see it after council has kicked it around once and see. What's
yeah,
survived?
that's a good process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So do you want a deadline for when you get,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm realistically going to council either the last October meeting or early November. What are we now? So,
So,
2 weeks by the end of September, say. Early October, because then I can start providing it to the council. And then I guess I would look for a recommendation to refer the draft, draft planning and development procedures bylaw to council.
Oh, okay.
One little detail, with regards to the 6 months, would 180 days, maybe a better way to phrase it? These months are.
Sure.
because if you came in on 182nd day,
That's it.
You're done.
you're
It's
up,
not-
right?
Yeah.
But you're within the 6 months.
Are there other
There are-
kinds
there are-
of
Well, there are business days, right?
days.
Then you have to do that.
Yeah.
How many applications for development do you have sitting that are lapsed?
Maybe 3 rezonings. And maybe a couple of development permits. Typically, the development permits lapse when they submit and we say, oh, you need to do a riparian assessment as well. And they don't want to do a riparian assessment, and then you have to pay money to do it and apply to the province, and then they just sit. And they go, yes, we're definitely going to do a
Yeah.
riparian assessment. This
So it's
year."
a way around that. It's
No,
required.
yeah, just kind of sits. Yeah.
That's a good segue to the next piece. Are there
Yes.
are there any
Yeah.
other comments about the procedural bylaw before we move on?
Do we need to make a motion for
Do we want a
forward
recommendation
it
now?
on the council?
Yeah, I think just to refer the draft
Okay.
bylaw to council.
Do we do that? The ABC refers
Or recommend council consider.
to Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Well,
Forward.
boots there, yeah.
That
Recommend
sounds
that
better.
Yeah.
council consider the proposed
Yeah.
development, blah, 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 bylaw as amended.
Yeah.
It's September 16. You can just say only do one reading, sir? For first reading?
I would just refer it and then we'll
Okay.
just do one reading.
So how's that read?
That the advisory planning commission recommend that council consider the proposed development bylaw as amended at its September 16, 2019 meeting.
All right, would like to make that motion? David, second? Mark? Any discussion on that? All in favor? We are unanimous.
Perfect.
Excellent. All right, so moving on to item 2. Conservation Development Subcommittee has prepared a report. Thank you very much for the work that was done on that, by the way. Dennis has offered to kind of walk through this somewhat briefly, but touch on the salient points, and we can open it up for a bit of discussion. So, without any further ado,
Okay.
over to you, Dennis.
I would like to really thank the committee that put this together. I mean, because everybody contributed, David Hawking and Louise Johnson and Michael Penny.
And Dennis.
Yeah, well,
And Dennis. And I did too.
everybody contributed to the evolution of the concepts, because this is a fairly new, it's a really important type of policy that for the island. And in fact, I went to the Islands Trust meeting earlier and met with Claire Frater, who's director of Trust Services, and she was really excited about what we were doing and wants to support us in any way she can. So, anyway, just wanted to sort of get a little bit on the record. The definition of conservation development is really seeking to protect the biodiversity, productive farmlands, ecosystems, landscapes, historic cultural resources, is sort of same stuff. And conservation development is both a goal and a process. So We want to achieve that, and we need to establish a process that leads us there. The sort of difference with development, conservation development, is that the developer and the planning authority work together to come up with a plan for the land, as opposed to the developer doing a plan and coming and getting approval that way. But the key thing is to respect the environmentally sensitive issues such as trails and open space. It features and trails and open space. There's a whole list of benefits of conservation development. And it's worth going through them in detail, but a sort of a key concept is protecting the natural capital. Anybody jump in if they want to add to it. But that includes developable land, includes soil, vegetation, rock, water features, and other sort of gifts of nature. And one of the things that we found is that the process can be complex, but residences actually adjacent to parkland are worth more than having an extra lot if they preserve that, which is an interesting thing because these homes would face on protected open space and trails. We propose that it generally not increase overall density, except that council could allow an increase in density as an incentive to provide additional amenities or building types. This type of development requires less infrastructure, such as roads and utilities, so they're actually less expensive to build and maintain. Requires let's see, it will result in a much more robust system of pathways and trails, which is pretty key, which can then support transit, kids getting access safely to transit, schools, whatever, and a more healthy lifestyle. It can also be, it'll reinforce the sort of natural character of Bowen, so that people driving through will see this, a large amount of connected open space and utilize it. And that really adds to the sort of natural environment that we aspire to. It can be fire smart because if you're starting to cluster houses, you can deal with the setback from the forest to preserve the homes that are in it. It can work for helping to work against climate change. Supports transit, encourages community connections so that actually people can get to places using the trails. And it can enhance the viability for here it is, viability for property owners, an average of 13% more value in homes than conventional subdivisions, which would be twice as large.
I question that somehow. If you build a house in a smaller lot, half the size, it can actually be worth 13% more. Is this, where is this from, growing greener? Is this anywhere to do with BC? Is it talking about houses in California or Nebraska?
Well, it's been a variety of developments over North America that went into that figure. That Randall Arndt, who's the guy who sort of invented conservation development, came up with. I think it's pretty realistic because in reality, homes which are facing a protected open space as opposed to just another property line will likely have an additional value because it's like an extension of their property. One of the issues we face is some people come in to Bowen and they'll buy a property and they'll just clear cut it from property line to property line and then build their home in the middle of it. And that's really anti where we're trying to go.
If you're a farmer, that's not anti.
No, if it's agricultural, yeah, and that agricultural lands are something that we want to.
But what is the difference between agriculture and you clear it and you have some grass and a horse and a farm? And nobody wants to be beside a farm. Let me tell you, nobody wants to be beside a farm. So this cluster development does not work for farmland at all.
You know, one good example of cluster development, sort of philosophically opposite to this, is golf course developments. And when you think about it, what happens there is a lot of, it's not natural area, but a lot of area is protected from development by the golf course itself. The houses that abut the golf course go for way more. You know, Randall Arndt is, I mean, we can question him, I suppose. He is the, I would say he is the expert on this. To prepare for the work we did, Dennis recommended a few of his books and I read them and so on. And he does make sense. And I can tell you the thing that concerned me as we worked on this project is and the viability. That word came out because we need to be concerned about viability for the developer. And you know, the first thing we'll hear from a developer is, if you don't let me build over the whole area, then I can't do it. It won't be profitable for me, it won't be viable for me. But there's a lot of evidence that you can build the same number of houses, but in a clustered way and still make the same profit. One of the things that's fascinating about lot size and profitability is you think of the Snug Cove House lots. Those are tiny, and yet the houses are going for...
If I can just regarding your question, the urban conservation practices in Canada report of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development, April 2013, 41st Parliament, first session. They talk about the quantifiable economic benefits of urban conservation, and in here it states property values surrounding natural parks might be expected to increase in value, and they say here up to 20%.
Well, I'm not challenging that. I think that's probably absolutely true. But I'm just wondering if they're talking about a lot twice as big, and this house near a park is worth 13% more than a house on twice the land. It seems to me that land is what costs money. When you build anywhere, the cost of construction of the building is about the same. It's the area that you're buying or the amount of land that you're paying for.
But a realtor will tell you that the three most important factors are location, location, and location. So,
of course.
I think topography on this island, that a real issue is topography. And so making blanket statements that cluster development is the only way to go is very challenging when there might only be one house site on this ledge and another one over on somewhere else. And so this is all really nice, but I'm not sure how practical it is. And I would hate to find us bogged down in some very restrictive language that cluster development is how it should be. When, if you're not talking about tract farmland, hey, for sure, you know, it's flat and cluster development probably makes sense. You don't have fire issues. One thing that really came to mind is I know there's somebody that's collecting land between Queen Charlotte Heights and Seymour Bay. One of the best things that would happen for this island for safety reasons is a ring road. A road so that people can get out. Now this prescriptive conservation development would deny that.
How, why?
Because it doesn't want, it wants, like when I read it, it seemed to say that you want minimum roads, you want.
No. I mean, that is a fundamental, road connection is a fundamental necessity.
But I'm afraid it doesn't come out in this at all.
Okay, well, we can make that more clear.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you would do cluster development in that area either. You know, so, you know, there's some, it's a very nice thing. I just am not sure how practical it is in this island with the area.
Well, if you actually make I think in a funny kind of way, you're making it the point for conservation development. Let's talk about that first. When you say that there are areas we just can't build on them anyway, those areas tend to be the natural areas that need to be preserved. You know, mountainsides, rivers, that sort of thing. So we're headed towards conservation development anyway. I don't think in principle there's anything wrong with a cluster of one house or two houses, if that's all the topography allows. But the whole point of conservation development is to be guided by the topography rather than the developer's wish for 16 square lots or a certain amount of property. That road point though is a good one, because what happens is that the transportation corridors become more clear in a cluster development than they otherwise would be. So I think that, yeah, it doesn't exclude ring roads. If anything, it might even encourage it, because it would make land available for it. So.
And the point right on the first page with conservation development talks about how it's different from past development practices perhaps. With conservation development, the developer and planning authority begin with the land itself, identifying natural areas that should be protected and preserved. So if you're starting with the land and you would just have a couple of chunks that are buildable, that's what the land tells you. It's not that, rather than trying to divide it up into a bunch of rectangles, you're looking at the land and seeing what the land needs.
Yeah, if you don't have room for a cluster, you ain't gonna get one, no matter what.
Yeah, the key is, really the key is starting with the land and what can you do with the land and what should be preserved and can we cluster and how much can we cluster?
Maybe I feel much more comfortable with a set of principles that ask some questions, as opposed to development principles that says how it should be done. You know, like that, when it said, as Michael put it, you know, like how many houses can you build beside each other, as opposed to thou shalt build cluster development, which this is a very much a more of a thou shalt than a what, you know, these are some questions that maybe a developer should talk to planning about as they move through the process. To me, that would be a much more, and I don't know whether that's practical or not, but
Well,
it's.
the practical side of it, the practical aspect of it is gonna come out when we consider the actual policy.
Yeah.
And, you know, Daniel's already commented that he needs more direction himself. But, you know, the policy just says incorporation of cluster development principles. It doesn't require cluster development as such, but.
One of the things in the context of this conversation
Yeah.
that came up for me, again, sort of with the devil's advocate hat on, if you will, there are certain provisions that are already in place that place limitations on development that are related to natural features, right? So there are the riparian area regulations, which we talked about, where there is an automatic setback for bodies of water, which you can get maybe smaller if you have, an impact study done by an environmental consultant, and you can tweak the SPIA. There's steep slope issues. Steep slopes are pretty challenging for building to begin with. So I guess the question is, are there already sufficient? And I know that some of the things that are discussed and described that would be things that we would want to preserve, ecosystems, but they're kind of broad terminology. But so I guess the question is whether we say, okay, there are some things that are in place already, we don't need to deal with those things, or are we going to have 2 layers of development criteria doing one thing?
Okay, we had that discussion for 2 reasons. One was we realized as we did the research and the review, which was part of our remit here, that a lot of this stuff is in place already by way of bylaws for riparian, the requirement for environmental reports, apparently the independent review. I mean, these are all aspects of conservation development. So the other thing that we said as we discussed it is we started looking at the various developments that were taking place on the island. And what we realized is, and I think in my own neighborhood, and the difference between, say, King Edward Bay and Bluewater, what you realize in the last 25 to 30 years, we have moved toward conservation development anyway. And that's probably because developers have realized that to get their subdivision approvals and various other things through council, they need to do that, and it's desired. They think it's desirable anyway.
Right.
So we did have that discussion about whether or not we're headed that way anyway, and so did we even need this work?
Right.
But since we were a committee, we had to decide we did need this. But I think what we
There's an identity crisis in the middle of all that, wasn't there?
but we thought it was an area where some clarity is required, exactly the kind of clarity you're talking about there. I mean, we have these individual restrictions,
Right.
and we have the vague idea that they fit with an overall pattern of conserving natural capital, but we've never really articulated it by policy, and that's where we're headed.
Right.
So that's why we need to do this
Okay.
work, I think.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
Dave.
so think of something like the new development that we just have, Grafton Lake.
Yes.
So, there are all sorts of things that need to be protected there, natural water courses and wetlands and so on. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, that land could have been divided up in a very, very different way.
Yes.
So as it is now, it's really clustered and clustered around the road,
Right.
basically. Which is exactly what we would like to see.
Right.
So we've got all the lake area protected, upslope areas protected, water courses protected, things you had to protect anyway, but we've also clustered
Right.
around transit,
Right.
which couldn't be better.
Yeah.
And 50 years ago, a developer would have filled in part of the lake
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
to create wonderful lakefront properties
Sure.
with basement leaks, but so there's been a change.
Yes, exactly.
In a funny kind of way, we're behind the curve here.
Where I see this helping too, I think, is that when we have the larger development, so like the Grafton one,
Yeah.
it's almost easier, I think, for a developer to look at it and go, okay, we're gonna ask for more units, and we're gonna, there's stuff we can save and not. And where I see sort of the approach of like, well, I'm just gonna make it into, 2 lots that are the full size or whatever, are the people who own lots that are maybe they're a 10-acre lot, and the zoning is 10 acres, but the OCP says 5 acres. They're the ones who either come in to see me, or when it's up for sale, they come in to see me because they go, okay, I can just rezone it, and then I'm gonna divide it in half, and then I'll have 2 5-acre lots. And then, and so is that sort of level of thing, I think that this is helpful for too, to say, well, our goal is actually not for you just to be able to split your 10-acre into 5-acre, but that's still a chance for us to consider it.
Okay, that's funny, because we used that example, we thought it was problematic, actually.
Yeah.
What's that?
The person with a 10-acre parcel wants to divide it to 2 5-acre parcels.
Right.
So, I mean, the horror story would be one 5-acre parcel is beautiful forest, rock, and stream, and the other one is flat land, it's horse pasture.
Right.
So you divide it up, and we're gonna tell the guy with the left-hand side, sorry, you can't build on it. So,
Right.
obviously, some sort of flexibility is gonna be required.
Yeah, but I guess I see more, it's like we had a policy that we point to and say, well, our goal is not for you to make 2 5-acre lots, and then maybe we can talk about a rezoning, but you're gonna end up with 3 1-acre or something, whatever, I don't know the site, but you know, like that's the conversation, it's not, you're not gonna end up with 2 5 acres.
You know, if you, and again, I know King Edward Bay well, but those lots are typically half an acre, and yet the density is 1 residence per acre. And make them a lot smaller, sure didn't make them cheaper, but the residents really like that notion where half the land is still the natural, as natural as the forest ever gets on board, but, and it,
This is basically the end, strikes me as basically what you're looking at when you have, what's the word I want? When somebody has a property and has a series of houses on it.
Strata.
Strata is basically looking towards a strata
Well,
concept, isn't it?
I think that was the,
well, and
that's
this is
the
one of
question
the,
is, what is the ownership model?
well, and that's one of the unresolved issues. How, okay, it's nice to say, let's preserve and protect the natural area. How? Stratas do that, but stratas can be deregistered, and I don't know. There's
One of the points in the report is about water and sewer, and that was the kind of the red flag for me around the question about ownership. So if it's not a strata, if they're, you know, if you're purchasing a property, a lot, and yeah, there's some parkland that runs around it, that's very nice. But if I have to provide my own water service, I've got to drill a well and have wastewater treatment system of some kind on my property. If that lot is too small, I can't do both.
Well, see, this is where cluster development does start making sense, because if you have a cluster of houses, then you could put the water infrastructure. Obviously, you need shorter pipelines between each house, but then you have a single water system that provides that cluster.
If it's not a strata,
Who owns it?
then
Yeah.
you become a purveyor of water, and there's a whole other set of rules about that. Suddenly, that's a water system that you're supplying various houses, and it has all of the challenges that go with it. Daily testing and all kinds of other things.
And that would be true even if you didn't have cluster development, and don't, probably not a good idea to get somebody from King Edward Bay started on water.
Yeah, please.
Right.
But, okay, I mean, that something does have to, the sense though is that you can make the utilities more efficient and cheaper to build
Right.
if you have
I
as much
think there are
clustering
probably
as
ways
possible.
around it, but it is interesting that conceptually, it feels like it would work better as a strata kind of development, rather than as
You
a
know what,
individual.
we had that
lots.
discussion about how do you do it from a government's point of view. And we have this fantasy about the Bowen Island Conservation Trust. But we're way short of that. But what we're hoping is a developer will approach the municipality and say, this is what I'm gonna do. And Daniel's gonna say, well, how are you going to guarantee preservation and protection of the national area? And then that discussion will take place. Whether it's by strata, whether it's by deeding the land to municipality or to Nature Conservation of Canada or whatever.
Right.
Those are all possibilities. But again, at this policy level, we didn't want to say, you have to have a strata or you have to.
No, I understand. I only raise it because I could begin to see the practical challenges of doing this in some other fashion other than a strata. But a strata sharing services is relatively straightforward. In other contexts, it's not straightforward at all.
Yeah, well, King Edward Bay, the municipality owns the water system, and the strata owns the septic, which is interesting, because as you can say, the municipality has got us coming, but we've got them going. And it is complicated, and it does cause
And
issues.
for three house developments, it doesn't make any sense for the municipality,
No.
but the water is challenging,
Yeah.
potable water and.
Yeah.
and
Well, you can't take sewage across property lines either. It's kind of, you know, unless it is a municipally regulated system. So there would definitely be challenges that would have to be overcome.
Yeah, I think what we're establishing now is that conservation development is not just about laying out the lots.
Agreed,
It's about utilities, it's about transport is a big deal.
yes.
But the point is that if you approach each of those issues from a conservation development process, a couple of things happen. One of them is that there's a consistent approach. So you're not using one set of criteria for transport and a different set of criteria for utilities.
Right.
And if there is that kind of consistent approach, then I was very concerned as we worked on this that the developer understand what it was that they needed to come forward with.
Right.
Because, you know, this is the collaborative aspect of it as well. We don't want a developer to put thousands of dollars into preparing plans and maps and dump it on Daniel's desk and he says, well, you know, you haven't dealt with this, that, the other thing. We want them to create the development almost jointly with the municipality and address these issues as they go along. Because that's something, you know, everybody emphasizes the conservation of the natural area thing, but collaboration is a huge aspect of what Randall Aaron talks about. And he even talks about, for example, when a developer buys a piece of land, invite the municipal planner out for a picnic and walk over the land and, you know, get to know the land and so on. And I think that's a much healthier approach all the way around.
I think it's a very laudable goal.
And maybe we can pump that up a bit in the report because that's pretty key as well.
I agree. Because, yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the other things, is some of the criteria or some of the goals are quite subjective. So if you say this rocky knoll, we've got to preserve it, and the developer looks at it and says, I don't think so, that doesn't strike me as being something worth preserving. You know, I can see the potential for, clearly there needs to be a lot of collaboration through the whole process. You know, otherwise it becomes, well, you know, I don't like yellow. So, you know, yellow's never beautiful in my world, right? So, I mean, but I think there's a danger of that, that's all. I'm sort of got you cut off halfway through.
No, that's fine. This is the discussion we need. Let's see. Basically, I'm not going to go through the detail of the conservation, the Bowen Island strategic plan and of the OCP and Metro Vancouver and the Islands Trust, but they're basically all supporting this type of development and trying to be very supportive of it. And talking to Claire Frater earlier today, she said there are ways that the Islands Trust can facilitate things like a subdivision when municipalities can't. By law, they have the ability to do it for smaller lots or whatever, you know, whatever that is. And she was talking about through their trust, their conservation trust, or whatever it's called. They have several places on the island that theirs and they're responsible for, and on a number of islands, and that they have funding for some maintenance, and they have, you know, they get donations for maintenance, and they coordinate with locals for volunteers. So there's one of the things that has concerned me through it all is that whoever we transfer this land to, I'm trying to avoid the municipality, because then that's just another labor that they have to fund, put on big staff, growing staff and everything, and come out of our taxes directly. But if it goes to this other place, trust.
They for it too.
Well, they do, but in a much more creative way. and they have the facilities, they're organized to do this. And, I mean, it's an option, and there may be many more.
Because my understanding that Randall Arndt was of the view that the developer should be the one, either the developer or the community who purchased the lots should be the ones who maintain the common land. Is that correct, or am I mistaken?
It varies with
Yeah.
the community to community, and the thing, yeah, he also, in a number of his subdivisions, what they do is they just sort of say, okay, we're saving this land, you know, they put a protection over it, you know, a restriction on the title, and then build it all up, you know. But the real danger of that is easily revocable. You know, when development pressures get high, they go back in and everybody agrees, well, let's just remove that and let's, you know, buy out the community and then re-subdivide it and get a whole bunch more
But
houses
isn't
on
that,
it.
yeah, that's what's happening today with single-family houses, they're getting rezoned into,
Exactly.
but what's wrong? Like, as the world moves forward and it becomes more sensible to have tall buildings rather than single-family,
Tall buildings as opposed to single family is fine.
That's cluster right there.
That's
Yeah,
cluster right there.
anyway,
It's just a bunch more
But it
scraping
still-
off the land to
but it
create
still
more
has to
single
go through
family
the muni,
homes.
it has to go through the current, you know, like, 100 years from now, it has to go through the same process. And it's not gonna pass if it's not gonna pass, or it is if the world's changed on us.
Well, okay,
Yeah,
what
like,
that
I have
does
a
is,
different, yeah.
that sort of works against preserving the tree cover and all these kinds of things, which,
But I just say that, 100 years from now, tree cover may not be where we're at.
Yeah, well, but if we don't preserve it now, then people can't wreck it 100 years
Yeah.
from now.
Yeah, but if we, I think preserving it,
I think the
but,
point is that we should be preserving what we can preserve. If
Yeah.
economic circumstances or
don't make it
climate change or
draconian.
something,
Yeah,
then that's gonna drive it down,
Yes.
but we should not give in, if I could put it
Yeah.
that way. And Drew, I have a bit of an answer for your practical thing, and how do you do this? And it was interesting looking at the way they did it in North Pender Island, which is Islands Trust.
Right.
They created a map, and they classified areas: woodland, herbaceous, riparian, wetland, cliff, and intertidal. And so if you're a developer, or if you're buying land in this area, you know what you're buying. You know, a little bit of herbaceous, a little bit of intertidal, whatever. And they had different procedures and different requirements for each of those ecosystems. So it's a nice, clear way of dealing with it. Now, I don't know if we'll ever, I mean, we have a pretty good sense. It was funny, because I realized that there are 8 different ways that green spaces are protected or allocated on the island currently.
Right.
And it's a total mismatch. It's everything from billionaires who are kind enough to let us walk through the forest that they own, to there's a provincial park, there's an ecological reserve, there's the Islands Trust has very thin, and you know, I mean, there's 8 different ways that green space is protected already.
Right.
So surely, somewhere among those 8, we can find something that works for us, and maybe even add a couple more.
Right.
As you can tell, Dennis was in the chair. He got us going on this. As you can tell.
I mean, it's interesting, because I personally, I don't have I'm not challenged by the word density, where I hear that word density is a challenge for many, but I think there's a way to achieve density through clusters. It's like, the West End, for instance, in Vancouver, is a great example of that kind of vertical cluster, if you will. And it's actually quite a livable community, because the buildings are so far apart and there's so much green space. And so that speaks to support this approach to development. If you say, well, yeah, we want green space and you can only have single family houses on it, then I think you start to run into a different problem.
yeah, and we're not proposing to change the zoning on properties. But you're right, that's exactly what we were considering, is that we whatever development and the future councils decide, they can densify the island, but they just go up in these areas and without wiping out all the trees that are on the island.
Right.
And going more horizontally, which every developer would probably rather do. So, so this is creating a structure, a flexible structure for density while we're preserving the important elements in the island.
Well said. Well said.
So, let's see, well, there's all kinds of reasons, considerations that we have about climate change and all that's happening, and transit and all that kind of stuff, transportation. The ability to create this really broad network of trails, I think, throughout the island is a really important element. The cluster development, and so cluster development in the policy is about, it's sort of defined in here, but cluster development can take so many different patterns and forms depending on the site and the elements and stuff. So we didn't want to limit it or straitjacket it. I think that a key thing is that this is a policy document that if council agrees with it, then we go back and do the ordinances and look again detail about where it applies, how it applies, that sort of thing to the zoning system and what lots and all that sort of thing. So that will generate a lot of discussion, there's no doubt, but getting elements of that into here, I'm a little leery of. I'd like people to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, how it fits with the momentum in this direction by all the governments in the region. Though it's got our own sort of flavor to it. We talk about conservation development. A lot of people talk about conservation subdivisions. Well, when we get into do analysis of sites, we can start to identify, well, that maybe you've got an opportunity to impound water there. And maybe you have opportunities to get solar. Maybe it makes sense to do, working with the developer, do the sharing of some utilities. All these kinds of things that come about in how the buildings are built and organized. So it's expanding it a little bit, but into areas that we've been talking about for years. Okay. Well, let's see. I guess we can just go to the policy. We're generally talking about at this point, policy is proposed to apply to any new residential development granted through a rezoning application, subdivision approval, or other development approval. And it would exclude, and have it in there somewhere, the code. So it wouldn't apply in any way to the code, just beyond the residential development. And if we decide to build some commercial development someplace else on the island, it would apply to that.
Although for what it's worth, we did have a discussion about commercial development. Louise raised the issue. We thought conservation development could apply to commercial and industrial areas as well.
Yeah.
Maybe ought to. Anyway, but we didn't do it.
Yeah, I could see where it could apply to some of the land across from the school, for example. That's not really in the Cove directly, but, I mean, they could work very well there.
Sorry, so just to summarize then, the primarily the focus is on residential development.
Yeah, primarily, yeah. Mainly because that's what it is. If commercial came in another location on the island, we would look at doing it with that as well. But we're
Either
not.
as a commercial development or mixed use
Or mixed use or industrial or anything like that. Now, it may be for one reason or another, you know, it may, well, I don't see why it wouldn't in some way, but we want to have flexibility to apply it. Then, I guess that, I mean, the statement really just sort of, the policy, development policy really just, that we would ask council to approve really is a summary of what all that background we've gone through. With just some limited graphics, I didn't want to get into any copyright infringements.
I think if I can just interject one thing, what this does is allows people a framework to start to think about conservation or development or cluster development as an overarching theme for the island. You know, when thinking about trail, like creating a trail system, when thinking about transportation corridors, when thinking about development, whether it's residential or commercial, if we start to use this language or incorporate this language, then people have a framework from which to make decisions.
Yeah.
The policy is pretty straightforward. It's really a checklist of 8 things, and that would be judged by the municipality. So Daniel will be working with the proponent to look at how natural capital is protected, and as you've heard, there are already 8 ways of doing that on the island. There could be more, and so on. But Daniel had some comments about the checklist, I think.
Yeah. Do you want me to go through?
Yeah, I was
your
gonna say, I have them somewhere.
Yeah, I got them. Let's see, policy considers the mean, you want to see more detail about the means by which natural areas will be permanently and irrevocably protected and maintained. And that's something we need to just, we don't know.
Okay.
But the result needs to be that.
Right, and I guess what I was thinking is, I know when we've talked about this at the council level, like I know some councilors think a big part, in their mind, a big part of conservation development is the protection of land, like held in the public hand. Or,
Yes.
you know, so whether that be that the public can access across, or just whether it's like a public entity is holding it. And so it wasn't clear from this, like if that's your position, or do you say, well, no, like a conservation covenant on the land is adequate or not, or how that is tied in, if you had a position on it, or you say, well, no, it just has to be worked out somehow?
No, we need to transfer ownership, not just govern by covenant. Because we don't want the pressures of slick developers and all that kind of stuff coming in and changing it.
Well, it does say permanently and irrevocably protected and maintained. That's really
I
what
find that very draconian.
But that's different, so like we have, or like around Josephine Lake, right, there's conservation covenants on the land, so if you own a property, has a covenant that we hold that says you can't do stuff,
Yeah,
and.
and I think
So,
that's
mean,
good,
that's
yeah.
one model, right, and then other people would say, well, that's not enough, it should be, you should own it, or the Islands Trust Fund should own it.
Is a covenant not permanent and irrevocable?
Well, it
Protection
is,
goes,
yeah.
runs with the title,
Yeah,
and we have them all over the island.
Mhm.
The problem, in my experience, is they're not always enforced. And that's the difficulty and that's the expense.
But if you
I know
transfer it to
also
municipalities.
Previous councils have been trying, as my understanding, trying to move away from the covenant as a process. I don't know if that's still true or not, but.
But, you know what, I think this is, the rest of it is sort of, how can I put it, not easy, but we have solutions, there are solutions available. This is where the rubber hits the road, or maybe I should say the sandals hit the trail. But, you know, this is where, clearly we got to do some work here. And it may well be that the answer is a little bit of a cop-out, and that is, it's going to depend upon the kind of land that's involved. And it's going to depend upon the will of the municipality. I mean, if the municipality is willing to take it on, or the province is willing to take it on as a public park, or wants to take it on as a public park, that's quite a different thing from the owners just saying, you know, we'll look after it. And I know I've heard from municipal people that they're a little reluctant to take on more parks because there's maintenance and liability. I mean, trees fall down,
Yeah.
for example. And that gets costly. So, yeah, we clearly have a lot of work to do, but none of that really should cause us to step away from the principles.
No, I don't think that. More, I just think it's like if the APC has a vision of what that is, then, you know, articulate it, or at least somewhere in it have a preference or something, so that the developer just then go work, you know, on it and come back and say, here it is, and it's all that draft all these covenants, and it's gonna be protected. And then APC says, well, we didn't mean that, we meant that it be a public, right? So if there's a preference that it says.
Yeah, this is where that early collaboration starts to pay off.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose we could say, you know, will be permanently and irrevocably protected and maintained.
And it doesn't even have to be, it doesn't even have to be like in the point per se, but maybe it's in, you know, when you define what things are, you're saying, when we say, you know, permanently protected, this is what permanent protection looks like.
You know what, when we did the first draft of this, those words permanently and irrevocably were not in it. We just said the means by which the natural areas will be protected and maintained.
Yeah.
But then we felt that didn't really say what we wanted.
Yeah.
So we added them, but maybe the answer is to go back to the softer language, make it less draconian.
Right, and then
Or-
outline it
Or
somewhere.
it could be in the definitions.
Yeah.
We could
I don't
have
think the
definitions.
language is the problem, I think the methodology is the problem. Like,
Yeah.
no, my notes say, it says how.
Yeah, well,
Like, you know, it's
yeah.
really because it's, if it's left to the landowners to maintain the parkland that's around them, that becomes fairly onerous after a while, and, you know, pretty soon the Blackberries win that battle. There's going to be no appetite for increases in taxes to look after these various parcels, I imagine, in the foreseeable future on the island. So it's a pretty tricky gray area. And nevertheless, as Dennis says, I mean, this, and as you said, and Michael, this is where the sandals hit the trail.
But that's why I make the point that there are already 8 mechanisms that protect green space on this island.
Right.
One of those might work, we could come up with a couple more, or the developer could come up with a couple more.
Right.
And again, I think it's gonna be site-specific. You know, for example, what if it's in an area that the public uses a great deal? You know, that might cause a different kind of level of protection, and anyway, but yeah, how is exactly the question? And really, I think it's the only, I don't want it to be a roadblock, I think there's got to be a solution to that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But it's a big challenge.
It is, absolutely it is, yeah.
The APC will volunteer to go out into the wilderness.
Is there any kind of bylaw or thing that is irrevocably in place? I mean,
No,
can our council
No.
change anything?
We just thought it sounded good and hopeful.
And in a
We know
sense,
perfectly well that legislation can change. And
And
the
as it
government
should.
changes.
As it should over decades and decades, things change and different things are important, and we have to be able to grow and change with the times.
I think we wanted to get away from the notion that the developer would do what would just make Daniel happy today.
Yeah, no, fair
And,
enough.
you know, even my own strata, which protects a lot of natural area, the protections are gonna, the protections are gonna expire when I'm 87.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's just a term for the building guidelines. Huh? The design
Who- so who
guidelines.
wrote
The design, okay.
And the design guidelines only last for 25 years.
Really?
The design guidelines, but what about the
But the design
zoning?
guidelines talk about the zoning is our, whatever it is, one.
It's only would be standard.
Yeah.
It's only
It's your
No.
building
Within the
envelopes.
development.
Expired?
Sorry?
The building envelopes expired?
Well,
Or the design?
no, the prohibition on, I mean, I can't cut down a tree,
Yeah.
but when I'm 87, I'm out there with my chainsaw.
Oh,
They're all gone. No, but, I mean, but then that's an example of,
Yeah.
and you may look at something like that and say, well, I'm not sure I like the 25 years. I think you might want to make it. Actually, I don't think I'll be 87. I think I'll just be 82. I'll be able to really use it. But again, I think that just illustrates, like every example requires a different solution, I think. And I think if we can build some flexibility in here so that nobody's constrained by having to do it a particular way, that could be important.
With the
Because
exception
we don't want
of
to
this,
hamper development.
sounds as if there's a wish though that it should be somehow public ownership and public maintenance, not private.
Well,
I think it only makes sense in some cases to make it public and not private. If you're doing a 10-acre lot split in half, you don't want public maintenance of,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
so I think it needs to be flexible.
Yeah, we don't say public. We don't say that at all.
Yeah.
No, I heard Dennis though alluding to
Well,
that.
I think that's
Well,
going to be the
public
default
ownership.
Right,
situation.
for larger developments at any rate. So the sense is that the answer to this is on a development by development basis, really, done in collaboration between the developer and the.
I think there are a number of vehicles for which this could apply. And I think when you talk about site-specific, I think that's important, because it's almost like matching whatever vehicle works best with the site. And there's another example I know of is the Georgian Bay Land Trust. And that's a group of people or an organization that purchases land in Georgian Bay for the purpose of conservation. They purchase it or it's donated to them for a tax incentive or a tax break. They maintain the piece of land. So I think as long as there's openness to preserve the land, there are vehicles that we could use to do so.
And it would depend on, there are all kinds of organizations like that here too, and including within the Islands Trust. But it would depend on the perceived risk or value, ecological value of that chunk of land. And so the various nature trusts would be interested if they thought, oh, this is really unique and it really does need protecting. If it's just kind of nice looking land that's not particularly unique, then you're not going to be able to get somebody like that to buy it or look after it. You'll have to come up with some other mechanism.
So in the Grafton Lake development, who's going to own the land
It's a good question.
around the lake? I mean, the lake is owned by the province.
It's a good question. It's a bit unclear. There was a proposal to Metro Vancouver that Metro Vancouver might be interested in expanding Crippen Park, but they're probably not because of certain issues around. Because it's also a water reservoir. The land is around it is a water source, and so that could be a problem for Metro Vancouver to make it a park because they need to protect.
Yeah, so the meaning will until the status quo right now is the municipality will own it as a park.
Okay. Would it become a dedicated park, or that Muni would just own it?
Dedicated
With no access to the water.
park. The trail around the lake. You can't go in.
A certain amount away from the water.
Yeah.
I think she's
What about
checking
the
the
swimming
chain.
Yeah.
What about the
I mean,
swimming?
we had talks with the Islands Trust Conservancy, so the Islands Trust Fund, I think, at various points with things, and they have like a criteria. They say, okay, we need to hit certain things before we want to take it on. There are some more organized than us in terms of, I think when somebody donates them the land or through a rezoning, they expect a certain amount of money as well to go with it. That's supposed to then maintain it.
That's not what I was getting from them, but she also mentioned that they have the ability to reduce taxes.
That's a different thing. That's the NAP.
Something like that.
Yeah. So that's something somebody can apply for on their property to say, I'm gonna protect a certain percent of it, and then you get your tax break on that part of it.
Yeah.
It can be reversed, is my understanding. So it's like something people can opt into on their property. And then in the future, somebody could, in essence, opt out. And you then owe the taxes that you've saved over the period. So, so if you said, okay, for 20 years, I'm going to protect half of my 10 acres by the all conserve and keep that criteria, but then you pass away and your kid wants to develop it, and they would owe the back taxes on it.
Well, but this is, what this does, this is for the lands that are going to be dedicated, so that's fixed and forever, and so why wouldn't their taxes be reduced based on that?
So wouldn't be if it's like part of a rezoning or something and you're giving up the land, that's never a donation.
See, and you may not need a formal dedication. I mean, the developer could just simply continue to own that land, but agree to preserve it. Can I just talk about the, I know you had some concerns about the specific policies, but I want to give you an idea of where we were headed on this. Yeah. These were not preconditions in the sense of, lots must be 80 meters by 20. So we said it should be considered on the basis of. So in a way, we're kind of creating headings for the applicant to fill in. And maybe you're not comfortable with this, and maybe it'll come out in ordinances and so on, but you would look at all the information that's in there, and you may, for example, under cluster development, you may see, because of the nature of the site, clustering of houses is not possible, and there might be an explanation and so on. Because it's not possible doesn't mean that the development is refused. It's just that it has to be considered in the application. Yeah. So I don't know if you're comfortable with that or not, but that's my way of thinking about this. It's guidance for you rather than stricter.
Yeah, I think my questions are more aiming at, I'd rather have the fullest discussion possible with the ABC and with council before it's adopted. So then when I bring something, that it's been discussed, as opposed to it sort of not having come up and then it's an issue. So I think that's more what I was trying to get at, was just each of the points, like, okay, how should that be determined?
A lot of things have come up, and I think the sticking point and the thing council's going to want to know every time, they're going to want to know density and they're going to want to know protection.
Yeah.
Well, I think we ought to have an open house or something on this, or some public, getting the public involved so that they see what's council doing to us is a big deal.
And I think just the other main one I think that was in my email is just the idea about density and increase, because I know so our OCP policy actually sounds really great in terms of cluster development that we have that says, so residential cluster development is preferred to large lot subdivision with areas of green space between clusters that are set aside by suitable legal instruments in perpetuity for both public and private neighborhood use.
Yeah.
So okay, that sounds pretty good. Except that when you go into the definitions, right, you say cluster development means it doesn't increase the permitted density of lots on the parcel. So it says, okay, maybe that works, maybe that doesn't. But so I wasn't clear. I think you've touched on it in terms of density and meeting housing needs, but is the idea of the policy that okay, you're meeting this, but you're having more lots than you otherwise would as a result of providing smaller lots?
I think we didn't want cluster development to create a demand by developers every time for more lots.
Okay.
And in fact, what we say in the report is that it would require council approval. And council would then be entitled to say, well, what are you going to give the people who are going on and in return? Are you going to give them a transportation corridor, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we wanted to, if you like, this is the sort of the how can I put it, the anti-development to say no, we cluster development does not mean increased density necessarily.
No, in fact, the default is
It
no
ought not
increase.
to if you do it right.
And there may be other thing that says it refers to other council objectives, which is maybe affordable housing. It may be taking some of these features and really developing them or improving where they become a public amenity for the whole area, or something like that. We're trying to be flexible and provide that opportunity, but not just put an absolute lid on it.
Yeah.
But isn't one of the beautiful things about this form of development that you could, in fact, have greater density through a neighborhood, and it wouldn't be perceived because you have so much more green space?
Right,
That's-
it's all sorts of different views. My personal view is like that.
Right.
It doesn't bother me about having additional density. And I look at the way the municipality is negotiated with developers over the years. Look at, Grafton Lake. Well, there's additional, that look at Belterra. I mean, Belterra was zoned for one home. And, but there was something that was really unique about that proposal. So it's sort of what you were saying and what it says in here. It's sort of like, okay, what kind of public amenities can we provide? And that becomes sort of an opportunity for a little give and take. My personal view is similar to yours. I'm not worried about additional homes.
Right.
I'm worried about the quality of how it all comes together and how it works with the overall values of Bowen Island.
Including affordability.
Including affordability and to
But
provide
again,
smaller
the
affordable
typology
homes.
needs to
Yeah.
be different. The building
Yeah.
typology needs to be
Yeah.
different. Affordability, single-family homes, even on small lots, are not affordable.
Exactly.
There needs to be a different typology that is less expensive to construct. And that, to me, is starting to put homes, more than one home, into a single building.
And we
And
certainly
that's
didn't
a
want
version
to,
of clustering.
say, we didn't want to speak against that in any way.
Right.
That's certainly an opportunity, there's certainly that opportunity within this frame.
Yeah, okay. That to me is a good thing. And
Yeah.
I'm sort of, there's a piece here about how this gets delivered to the public and how they will respond to it. That, I don't know, again, there are potential concerns there that are not my concerns.
I'll just speak to that one a little bit more. So we had, a bunch of us were at this this workshop last June 7th, so June 7th, a year and a third ago. And when we looked at the community lands, we did a workshop on the community lands. And what was really coming out of all of that discussion was the need for different home types so that we could have more affordable attached homes. And also the whole idea, without people saying the words perhaps conservation development, but clustering things together so you have pathways and so on in between. So how it all worked together with non-auto-based transportation was really important to people, with open space where people could get together and all of that sort of stuff. So the notions of clustering, the notions of different forms of housing that were more affordable were in that whole meeting of, I don't know, about 80 people, there was not a single person opposed multifamily housing, which is pretty unique for Buffalo. It was sort of, okay, this is different.
So how do we move this forward? What's our next step?
Right. That's a good question.
So I asked it.
So over to you, Daniel, a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think we need to help Daniel a little bit more.
Because I sense we're not quite there yet. What is it that we want, or because you obviously want to take something to council.
Well, I mean, this is a slightly different one in terms of this being a council strategic priority, so in the island plan, so I'm just looking at what the island plan says.
Island plan, by the way, is on all of your agendas and in Fridays.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
So it says, for conservation development principles through the APC, review relevant background material, review similar bylaws or policies in other communities, consult with Metro Vancouver and Islands Trust, present completed research and recommendation to council, draft policy.
Oh, okay, so we did all of that.
Yeah.
So,
The boxes are all checked, you can all.
I'm wondering if the
It
next
is,
practical step is
B1.
for our subcommittee to meet with Daniel
I
and
think
try
so.
and refine
Yeah.
the policy in
Yeah.
particular.
Yeah.
I frankly think the report's ready to go.
I do too. That was my
But
impression.
we need to answer some of the hard questions about the policy, and
Yeah.
Daniel can give us some practical advice on that. And do we do have one more meeting here before it goes to council, I think?
Oh, but
Consider amendments, I think.
November.
October 21st.
Yeah, so we've got, Mr. Sub-Chairman. And, you know, it's funny, Daniel, because you pointed out the problems that we saw as well. It's just that we thought we had solved.
Well, and there's
No,
some,
we knew there were
and
problems.
there's a number of things that we want to be flexible about. We're not trying to be rigid, and we don't want to sort of predetermine once we get into the details. I mean, that's a whole other operation. So it really is the policy and the concept which this elaborates on.
Can I
And
make one
that's what
more?
we need buy-in.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Just looking at so much is dependent on collaboration in this approach. I don't know why it's item 4.
Could be up the top.
Yeah, I would have put it up at 1 or 2. I just think
Yeah,
it's,
good point.
because I think what we want to do somehow is have these 8 points be meaningful and be something that Daniel can present to council in a way that everybody, so I don't know whether the points need to be fleshed out a bit more to explain them to, you know, we all like, you know, sort of bullet points and a nice, clean, clear statement. But the who and the how questions, I think we need to leave them hanging. They look like they're just hanging.
Yeah, you know, some municipalities, and Randall Aaron's, most of his practice has been in the US.
Right?
And I was reading about one municipality, I think it was in Pennsylvania somewhere. They do exactly that. They say that when the developer, I used one example, the developer and the planner have to walk the lot.
Right.
And, you know, they have to do, et cetera, et cetera. So that it's absolutely set out that way. I don't think we're ready for that kind of granularity, but we can expand.
Yeah, and I don't think that, to Kirsty's earlier point, we can become too prescriptive as well. But if we're saying that, you know, for instance, we're saying an analysis of the extent and value of existing natural features, who's going to make that determination? There should be something in that statement that says this, the features, the extent and the value will be determined going back to that collaboration between the developer and the planner or whoever else, or is there going to be a committee that goes out on these things, or, you know, because that's what Bowen
Isn't
needs is
that-
another
yeah,
committee.
and that's gonna depend on the size of the development and where it is.
Yes. And again, we weaseled out of that one a little bit, if you read it carefully. We didn't say conclusions, we said an analysis.
Right.
So I'm not wondering if we don't put the collaborative part in the preamble. You know, that the process will be a collaborative process.
It's so critical, I think it
And
should.
then bring, anyway, we can,
Yeah, it needs a little.
And is it, and I just go back, is it principles or is it policy? Because principles is a much more flexible way. Policy makes it very prescriptive, just in the word policy, it's prescriptive. Anyway,
The
I
request was for a policy.
Yeah.
wasn't it?
And, I mean, in essence, it's a policy for council. I mean, that's its sort of function, right?
It's not a policy for developers.
It's a
per
policy
se.
for, end of the line, right, as I see it, it's like a policy for council in determining a rezoning. So it's there for staff and for developers to guide them, to say, this is what council's looking for. And generally, you know, it's kind of in there, it's like, okay, if the developer says, well, you know, I can only do protected to this extent, then explain it.
you know, the other thing that was always on our mind is we didn't want to do something that would discourage development. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
Is there a problem calling it conservation development guidelines?
Well, we were told to do a policy, so we do a policy.
Right.
Well, I think policy is
I think we-
better. It's got more wiggle room in it and flexibility.
Then guidelines?
Well,
So I work with provincial guidelines a lot, and basically they're rules that you have to follow. You have to have a really good reason not to.
Okay, so policy
You have to
is,
document.
So So they're guidelines, but if you don't follow them,
You, yeah.
So it's
I
sort of
mean,
optional.
it's
You don't have to know the
semantics
building.
is really what Daniel was saying.
Well, they,
Yeah.
de facto, they end up being what staff will rely on to review a project. And I'm sort of wondering about, looking at the process and how that would go through. Would it maybe go to the planning commission as a recommendation to the city manager who approves subdivisions, but gives us the ability to sort of review and give
So,
Daniel and planning staff
I think the test has to be this, that you make a decision and somebody challenges it, you have to be able to say, my decision is right because I followed these things,
so I guess how it goes through is like, so in rezonings, I don't make any decisions, right? Council makes
Okay, make
decisions,
recommendations.
right?
Yeah.
And so I would use this to guide it, and say, this is what council's looking for, these are one of our policies that we're looking for, and this is how, this is how it works. And
Exactly.
that's often I do is like, lots of door kickers, people come in and say, what can I do with my property? And so this would be another piece, we say, okay, so if you want to think about rezoning, you're looking for this. The other one is that like subdivisions are done by the approving officer, approves them, who's Kathy, who's our CEO, and she approves it, and she has to consider, or the approving officer may use policies to consider, but the approving officer is like an independent decision maker. So to that extent, it's like council doesn't direct the approving officer, and I don't. So they would determine it, so they would use, the OCP and other policies that we have as guides for it, but it gets trickier, like if somebody came in, like they have sort of independent authority, and so we say, this is a policy, and so I got subdivision referred, I would say, okay, you should be using these policies, but it gets fuzzier. But the rezoning is a really simple one for council, because council makes the decision, and it's straightforward.
Well, I mean, are you talking about this being the end of the line, or another piece that puts out some standards? Like, most of these districts have 50 to 60% dedication of open space. And so should we be putting that in here right now as opposed to, where are, if I was thinking we would come up with an ordinance or something that would say, this applies to certain zoning categories or property sizes or what have you, and it involves dedication of X amount of open space and all that kind of thing.
That would then be like amending our land use bylaw in terms of actually bringing it into
Yes.
zoning.
Yes,
Potentially,
yes.
So then that, I guess that could be a second step.
That would be the next step,
Yeah.
I would say,
Because in essence, like the rezoning policy is easier because rezoning is discretionary for council. So we can have a policy that says this is what we're aiming for, and people want to do it, well, they don't have to get rezoned, or council can determine it, versus putting it in zoning and then it's changed, okay, what are people's rights within the zoning? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, making, if you made it mandatory for all new developments, I mean, which are of certain size or larger, even ones that now have zoning,
Yeah.
and you have, I don't know, pick a number, a hectare or larger, when you plan your lot, you need to dedicate that space, that open
Yeah.
space.
I won't support that. Excuse me.
That gets trickier in terms of like what we can do under local government act and what our authority is.
Well, I think that's worth investigating, because if we don't do that, if we only apply it to rezonings,
Yeah.
then we're not going to have much product. We won't really have that network of open space. We won't preserve many trees. You know, we don't have a trees bylaw, which makes people not clear cut their properties. So, you know, do we get any much bang for the buck?
Aren't those the only two possible tools, though? Rezonings or policy set against, rezoning policies or bylaw?
Yeah, I mean, rezoning policy, capture things at rezonings, we could change land use bylaw and capture things at subdivision.
This is really more about subdivision. It's not.
Yeah.
I should point out, the definition of development we
Yeah.
didn't make up. It's
Yeah.
actually word for word from the affordable housing policy.
Mhm.
So I don't know how the affordable housing policy is going to integrate with various authorities.
Yeah.
But we just assumed it had been, and that we could use this definition accordingly. But we'll have to talk about it, I guess.
Yeah, more thinking like changing subdivision.
Because rezoning is a step on
Yeah.
the way to
Yeah.
some form of subdivision,
Yeah.
most likely.
Yeah.
So
if you
those two
set
things
the
are
rules
gonna
at
come
that
together
point,
at some
yeah,
point, right?
Yeah.
So conceptually, it's about any developer who's wanting to reconfigure the lots on their larger parcel of land, that's what it's about.
Yeah. So more, I guess I'm thinking of, you know, the case of somebody who owns a 10-acre property that has zoning to be 5 acres, to be two
Right.
5-acre lots, and they know that that's their zoning that they have. And they came and they applied to be two 5-acre lots to subdivide. It's like the role that this would play at that point in saying, well, no, you have to have smaller lots and you have to make a park dedication. You have to somehow, you know, like the approving officer has an ability at that stage to say you need to do an environmental assessment, and anything that's environmentally sensitive, you need to place covenants on to protect. Versus the approving officer being able to actually say, you need to dedicate park. I think we can do. If you're subdividing 5 lots, there's a requirement for a park dedication already. But I'm thinking about those smaller ones where you're already zoned to subdivide, and you come to subdivide, you know, what authority do we have?
But if you have 10-acre parcels, you're gonna split the 2 5-acre parcels, I mean, almost none of this really applies to something like that. It really doesn't become operative until you decide you need to build 2 houses on those 2 lots.
Yeah, but under the zoning, you subdivide and create 2 5-acre lots that each have the zoning of rural, whatever, then it's like you can build with a building permit.
I think we need to get it in ordinance form, that, when they do that, but you can't actually declare what it is, but they have to go through a certain process, and dedication must equal 50% of the land.
Well, you know, to use the extreme example, say you have 5 acres of riparian land and 5 acres non-riparian land, and you split it so that all the riparian land ends up in 5 acres. You can't develop that, right?
Yeah, so that, I mean, in that case, the subdivision can get approved because there's not a buildable site on it.
Yeah. So I would hope that would control things a bit, but anyway, okay, I won't talk about it.
How does this dovetail with the provincial legislation about lot size? So, you know, for instance, you can subdivide down to 10 acres and have no services provided on the lot.
Yeah.
Right? And there's really nothing that will prohibit a landowner who's older parcel from doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, none of this is, I mean, we can't change the provincial legislation, that's gonna exist anyway.
Exactly. So I just wonder how, if that becomes problematic, that
Well-
I don't know.
Well, I think it is problematic in the sense that it impairs any attempt to pursue conservation development guidelines or conservation development processes.
Right,
And maybe somebody should point that out to the province, but
right.
we can't change it. It's just, you know.
So but it may be useful to understand that that's kind of, there's a too small project and there's a too big project. if both were just doing what they could lawfully do under provincial legislation. And this approach applies to something between those two.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we call it a conservation development. I mean, that gets an asterisk on the map or something. They've done a subdivision of it, and it's gonna have to follow the guidelines.
So, but I guess my
Conservation
point being,
development.
Dennis, that you can't, I don't know, would this legislation be able to trump a developer who says, well, all I wanna do with my 100-acre parcel is divide it into 10
No,
parcels?
it wouldn't, but the hope would be that that's a default position for a lot of developers. They don't want to do it that way. I suspect it's not the most profitable way of doing
Right.
it. So we're giving them a way of maximizing their profits. That's the way I see it.
Right,
While also preserving some of the natural capital. And it's only after that process fails that the developer would just say, I'm going to do 10-acre lots.
right.
But if the developer is committed to, in their own mind, to do 10-acre lots from day one, it doesn't matter.
Right.
We're not going to make any difference.
Sure. I guess I'm looking for some sense of the applicability of what we're doing here.
Well, I'm going to talk to Daniel about it, but I'm just wondering if we don't exclude anything under 10 acres
Yes, that's my.
because it's so problematic.
Right,
But then I would like to get people thinking along these lines, even for the smaller parcels. I think it's to their benefit in the end.
right,
And it may well be that they could divide their 10-acre parcel into 2 5-acre lots, and maybe a municipality can get a trail across it or something like that.
yeah, that is already.
That already happened.
To some extent.
Yeah, no, I can think of an example. Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know, I think for me, some of the excitement is on the smaller lots, is on the 10-acre lot that wants to go to 2 and say, okay, you can have 2, and then you're actually gonna protect some of it, I think is it. Like there's one, I think, an example, I think that's for sale, that I think is zoned, or maybe the OCP is for 4 lots. And everybody comes, because it's sort of been off and on the market, everybody comes with a plan, they go like, we're gonna create 4, and I forget, maybe it's a 20-acre lot, and we're gonna create 4 or 5-acre parcels. But versus saying, I'm gonna cluster it here and the rest is gonna be park, and, you know, it seems like a perfect example to say, no, what you're gonna do is you're gonna cluster it closer to the main road and protect the balance of it.
And you make each of those lots more valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some commentators say.
Yeah, I'm still not getting why we couldn't apply to any subdivision of land. And they don't need to build it, but it follows development. Once they go for a development permit, that's when it all kicks in.
So, I mean, we have a development permit for watershed protection, and that's your development permit. So the majority of houses on Bowen, you subdivide and you get a building permit, and a building permit is granted if you meet the building code, you get a building permit.
Yeah, and we're trying to intervene at that point.
Right, so I'm saying, at that point, I feel like it's too far down, like, either to intervene, that's either it's zoning changes, or it's new development permit area, or it's something like that would have to come in place to say, yeah, because right now, like, if you have a lot, you can build on it, you get a building permit.
Yeah.
But you're still subject to a lot of conservation development principles, steep slopes, riparian, et cetera, et cetera.
We don't actually have steep slopes. But
Yeah, I guess that's true, but riparian.
Yeah.
But if we take the example of the 10-acre lot, and half of it is great habitat we want to protect, the concept would be that the proponent would still be able to get 2 buildable parcels somehow on that property. Right?
Yeah,
If they weren't following these guidelines, they would get 2. If they could still get 2 and follow the conservation development guidelines. And
They might just have to draw the boundaries differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying, I think that's manageable. So I think you painted the kind of the worst possible scenario. I mean, and it's obviously worth looking at that, but what if the 5-acre balance could actually be divided into 2 parcels or made into a strata that could have 2 homes?
Yeah.
So,
That would be,
And I
Right,
think
and
that
line with
speaks
these
to
principles, yeah.
what Dan was talking about as
Yeah.
well, so. Are we getting closer to clarity about what our next step is here?
Meeting with Daniel.
Meeting with Daniel.
Yeah,
Right.
so subcommittee with Daniel, if that's
Yeah.
okay with you.
And then to come back to the October ABC meeting.
Sometime between now and the next meeting.
Yeah,
This-
and then they going to council following that.
Yeah.
So the main purpose of the meeting and the next couple of steps is about amending and refining the policy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we may take into account one or two comments about the report, I think,
Right.
yeah, if I've got them right.
So I think it might be, while I
But
would
mostly
appreciate
the
it,
policy, yeah.
while I would appreciate it if the subcommittee carries on that work, as you develop that and before our next meeting, if you wanted to distribute that to everyone on the commission, that might be useful too. Maybe it would be a little bit of feedback from that process.
Before meeting Daniel or after meeting Daniel?
After meeting then.
After meeting Daniel and having another go at this.
So does council want this, like this comparative communities research provided for them?
I mean, I think what's in the report is a review of like Metro and Vancouver Islands Trust policies
Yeah.
as well as our
Yeah,
policies.
they asked us to do all that.
Yeah. So what's not in the report isn't the like similar bylaws in other communities, but then you weren't able to find it exact. You sort of brought in research instead, I guess, which is similar to that, right? It's background material.
Yeah, we didn't have any other,
Well, we had Manitoba. Which,
not Metro Vancouver or the Islands. Trust.
Yeah.
We don't
yeah,
have
and,
neighboring.
yes,
Yeah.
well, the Islands Trust is really pretty straightforward, and they went out and mapped it and did stuff, so,
Is that what Michael was saying, that North Pender Island might have something interesting to look at in terms
Yeah,
of...
just a part of the island, part of Penn Drive, not the whole island, just part of it.
Okay.
I thought that was interesting, but that of course begs the question of who gets to decide. I guess then the Islands Trust must have decided this is herbaceous, this is
Someone,
cliff, this
right.
is, because some of them I think are a little, some of them are clear. We all know what a cliff looks like, but herbaceous, that's where the grow operations are.
Yeah. I guess I only wonder, it sounds like it's quite specific, and it's policy, and there's someone who's developed it and everyone seems to have agreed on it. And that's kind of that's the journey we're on right now. And if that would help us to determine the who for item B.
Or did everyone agree on it, or was it just written on a map and done? Which is what happens with a lot of the lots on Boland.
And that's what we do already,
The owner
so we
didn't
call
agree.
it zoning.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right, well, that seems like we're clear about the next couple of steps. I think it would be good to keep the whole commission informed about where we're headed, and maybe make the next meeting a little more, briefer. But thank you for all the work you did to get here. It's great.
Yeah. And I wore my green shirt this time. We had one meeting where everyone was dressed in green.
Oh,
It seemed appropriate.
When we all go to the council meeting, with the report, we'll be dressed in green.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, is there any business, further
I
business?
think that's the
Is that
last.
it?
last-
Okay, David Rich, it's your
Time to
time.
pull the trigger,